Today, I'll be speaking with Bob Robertson about the necessity for law firms to continue and deepen, as well as accelerate, their focus on their clients. Robertson believes, however, that this time around, they'll need to use a different vocabulary in order to remain competitive. Welcome to Law Firm Weekly. It's really good to have you here. Bob Robertson is a senior consultant with PP&C Consulting. He specializes in advising law firms on innovative business development and marketing strategies. Among his previous roles, he was the Chief Marketing Officer for Greenberg Traurig and Director of Strategic Business Development for Cadwalader. Bob, welcome to the studio.
Thanks for having me, Shai.
So the starting point for so many of my interviews right now is obviously the social distancing that we're all experiencing. Excuse me. And before we get to talk about the nuts and bolts of our focus point here, which is law firms and how they market during this time and beyond, how are you finding social distancing, or actually more accurately, let's call it client distancing? Is this affecting you at all?
Actually, it's the way I've been working for quite some time. Having worked in a very large firm at Greenberg, for instance, we had folks spread out all around the country. And so this idea of remote work was something that I was pretty accustomed to, because the persons that I managed directly were not often in the office that I sat in, and often in places all around the country and all around the world. So it's not all that unusual, frankly. In terms of client interface, I find that clients are also adapting radically and quickly to this environment as well. And it's amazing to me that, individuals who really didn't have much of a sense of how to use Zoom or Blue Jeans or any of the platforms are just, right on it. And they want to have video, for example, and a video interface, and they want to connect face to face using these platforms. So I find it, to the most part, to be accelerated, but not all that different.
I've interviewed Jim McKenna the other day, and he talked about eye contact and the huge difference that video conferencing platforms make in that regard. So I hear you loud and clear. So in our early conversation, you said, and I'm paraphrasing, some may think this is a COVID-19 related financial challenge to law firms. I see it differently. What did you mean by that?
It's really a challenge on a number of different fronts. I mean, there's the immediate challenge of having to manage COVID-19 as an operation, right, as a law firm in terms of the operations of the firm. But it's actually a challenge that accelerates a bunch of trends that took place prior to COVID-19. And part of that, why it accelerates, is because of the financial challenges it creates, both for the firms and for the clients that they serve. Prior to sort of the COVID-19 phenomena coming to life in a big way for all of us, we had seen the beginnings of a really super competitive environment for law firms. We saw, for instance, the emergence of alternative legal service providers, not only the emergence, but sort of the establishment, the acceptance of alternative legal service providers, and we saw firms even partnering with some of them. Just prior to the pandemic sort of taking root, we saw in-house legal departments really blossoming into mini law firms in many cases, and really deciding strategically what work they were going to keep and which work they were actually going to give to law firms. We saw mega firms who had traditionally focused on key legal markets, looking at secondary markets as well. We saw that, for example, in Denton's Golden Spike strategy and other firms that really were looking at other markets. We saw, as well as the emergence of accounting firms and other consulting firms, going after types of work that have been traditionally sort of the bread and butter, not particularly highly strategic or potentially highly profitable work, but the bread and butter of firms like labor and employment and immigration, and other types of work, for example, with the Deloittes and et cetera, really making an effort to try to get into that business on a global scale. And that challenged many of the global players that were in that space. So we saw all of this kind of percolating prior to the COVID-19 crisis sort of coming to light. And then what's happened is, because of the tremendous financial pressures that clients are facing, if you step back, just think about industries that are literally kind of on life support right now, whether that be the parts of the entertainment industry, hotels, tourism, etc. So you have tremendous financial pressure for certain clients, and they in turn are looking to their legal departments to become far more efficient and far more cost effective. So this has accelerated the competitive environment in so many different ways. So it actually requires firms to develop a different kind of vocabulary in speaking to clients, because it's not just about the legal service, it's about the delivery of the service and the cost efficiency of the service. So it's actually a much more jarring kind of phenomena than we perhaps experienced in 2008, because it's just the nature of how it's impacted so many different industries in such a quick and in many ways a lethal way, if you want to look at it that way.
I think that in some ways you've kind of answered my next question. And the question that I had was whether the average large law firm, let's say MLaw 100, who has already fairly sophisticated, if not very sophisticated, business development and marketing projects and initiatives and a strategy in place, do they need to do much more of the same, of where they were and what they need to do? Or you've just kind of mentioned and used the term, they need to kind of use a different vocabulary. So if it's not more of the same, what is that different vocabulary? What specifically and tactically does it look like?
Well, I think this is a much used term, but they must be much more client-centric. And what I mean by that is they really need to be client-facing. The business development and marketing functions in those firms really need to take on a greater client-facing role. Not only in terms of trying to sell legal services, because that's been going on a little bit for a while in firms, but really trying to get in understanding the nuts and bolts of what's going on for their clients and addressing those needs around the service as well. Prior to this phenomena sort of hitting us full force, there were experiments with this. We saw roles emerging in the marketplace, client relations, chief client relations officers or chief client service officers. And we also saw the emergence and a greater interest in client-facing sales roles. By the way, an interest which continues to this day, because anecdotally speaking, from what I see in the market, those roles continue to be hired because firms are looking at revenue and the need for revenue as a top priority. Other marketing business development roles don't seem to be really getting much traction in firms. They're really looking at finance, and they're looking at these sales roles. But with these sales roles, however, may or may not, depending on the firm, actually address the bigger question. The bigger question is, okay, what do I do to differentiate myself with that client? Just not, selling a service, but providing a broader answer to the issues that they're facing, whether that be, for example, partnering on a technology solution, or perhaps doing a secondment, or perhaps even doing something totally innovative, sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Taking a legal service apart, for instance, and deciding that that another service provider might be better suited to part of that service, and that perhaps the lawyers in the firm that you're in might be better suited to providing more strategic advice. So basically what they're looking for is not simply selling a service, which is what typically these sales roles have been about to a great extent, but to actually look at a broader set of issues that these clients are facing and to try to come up with innovative solutions. That might be, for example, co-partnering on a technology solution they would create together, or a secondment, or maybe even partnering with another service provider and disaggregating the service, right? So for really coming to grips with the fact that perhaps the firm is best equipped to provide strategic advice, but another service provider could provide more the nuts and bolts advice, or a different service altogether. So that's what's really required, because if you step back and look at the competitive set, you're looking at folks that maybe come out of consulting, maybe coming out of more of a business background, not necessarily lawyers and speaking a lawyer speak, and they have a different kind of vocabulary when they talk to clients. They really are looking at driving solutions to broader problems, not just the legal issue at hand.
So let me press a little bit on the specifics of what are the deficiencies, or one single big deficiency that you feel exists in relations to where the market is because of this sea change that we're seeing happening. Not just COVID-19 itself, the
Right.
distancing issues that people deal with, the short to medium term impact, but what most people consider to be a longer term impact. What is that single deficiency that many law firms still have, and what should they be doing about it in order to remain very competitive and in some ways actually take advantage of it?
I think the deficiency can be articulated like this. And it sounds simplistic, but it really isn't, right? We've talked a lot about being client centric, and many firms espouse that. I'm very client centric. I'm all about the clients all the time, and they are. But often what happens is that when they look at themselves and they actually create their own strategy and they look at their operations, they start to look inward, right? They're not really getting information from clients about the kind of organization they should be. They start talking amongst themselves in a kind of a vacuum and a conversation with each other about, the market, where they should be, what clients think. This continues to this day. This is why there's great value, for example, in exercises like client journey mapping, like client interviews, because you get a different perspective. You get the client's perspective, and really putting yourself in the client's shoes and understanding how they experience your service. Now, people hear that and they think it's kind of, marketing, sort of marketing mumbo jumbo, right? But really, what it really means is taking a different approach. It's taking an approach where you actually go into the market, go with clients and really experience a service and hear what they have to say, and then retool your service and retool your firm to be in response to that, which is a whole different approach than to simply say, oh, we understand our clients' needs and we're here to serve them, but you never take it to the next step. I think you need to take it to the next step in this environment.
And what I hear you say essentially is that it comes down to this idea that this transition we're going through right now will accelerate the need for that to happen, will reemphasize how important this is in order for the firm to retain its edge and competitiveness. One last question. We have very, very little time, so maybe in 30 seconds you can respond to this idea that at least in the short to medium term, law firms will need to focus on some of their clients that are now facing financial uncertainty, and that for some of them at least, it's transitional. It's only going to last, say, for the next 12 months. Many of them are large enough to withstand the shock, but it's difficult right now. Should there be a different strategy for this kind of short to long-term focus on some of those clients, and in very, very general terms, what can it be? And here, I just stole your 30 seconds, so you have 15 seconds left.
I think you have to be committed to your client regardless of the outcome, right, of their trajectory. Because there are services and there's advice and there are opportunities to be had regardless of what's going on with those clients, frankly. And then don't forget the business is about relationships as well. And you don't always know where the folks in those organizations are going to end up. So the reality is focus on relationships, focus on those clients, continue to nurture those relationships, obviously in a thoughtful and financially prudent way. But there shouldn't really be a difference between approaching those two, because it's really about service and really understanding that the service is really the differentiator for you moving forward.
So what you're saying is, if you're stepping up, to the challenge, if you're doing this kind of, somebody said, one of my other interviewees, Dr. Friedrich Blaise, called it clienting, this brutal focus on your clients, then the way you focus on those who are going through tough times is just the continuity of it, as opposed to a whole new strategy that you need to develop. Well, I think we've reached the end of this interview, Bob. It was a great pleasure to have you here. I really want to thank you for taking the time and share with us your knowledge and insights.
With a great pleasure, Shah.